Hello. Good morning. Welcome to Luma Hall, to the Grande Halle. I'm Flora Katz, curator here at Luma. We are delighted and very much honored to welcome you today for a unique conversation between two immense figures of the contemporary cultural landscape, the artist William Kentridge and the great thinker Homi K. Bhabha. I will start my introduction with a quote. I will start my introduction with a quote from you, Homi. It is from those who have suffered the condemnation of history, subjugation, domination, diaspora, displacement, that we learn our most enduring lessons of life and thoughts. There is even a growing conviction that the affective experience of social marginality transforms our critical strategies. The sentence from Homi Bhabha, professor of humanities in the departments of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, is taken from his book, The Location of Culture, Nation and Narration, published in 1994, a seminal work on post-colonial thinking and culture today. It condenses some of the immense issues at stake in the chamber opera, The Great Yes and the Great No, conceived by William Kentridge, which you may have seen last night, or will see tonight at Luma, or later on its forthcoming world tour. The Great Yes, the Great No, set on a cargo ship en route from Marseille to Martinique in March 41, fleeing the Nazi regime of Vichy, tells a trans-historical and trans-cultural story of displacement, escape, slavery, migration, but also revolution. Based on a true story, an historical crossing where illustrious intellectual figures, such as the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, the surrealist André Breton, the photographer Germaine Krull, or the painter Wilfredo Lam, escaped from Vichy France, the artist William Kentridge summoned on this boat other illustrious figures from the literary and political movement of the 30s, the Négritude movement, such as Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and the Nardal sisters, as well as political figures from Marxist thinking to reflect on question of class and race during this boat crossing. A chorus of 7 women, like the Furies in Aeschylus, accompany this crossing, combining the fears and hope of a world we're leaving behind and the world towards which we're heading as yet unknown. The Great Yes, the Great No is the third production that William Kentridge has created with the Center for the Less Good Idea after The Head and the Load and Waiting for Sibyl. But William has directed a number of opera pieces and theater all along his career, from his very beginning in South Africa with the Junction Avenue Theatre Company in the 70s, until today, where he presents shows at the Opéra Bastille in Paris and the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Established in Johannesburg in 2016 with Bronnie Lace, the Center for the Less Good Idea is an interdisciplinary space for experimental production. The Great Yes, the Great No is in part the result of many years of work with the center, a process which culminated with an exceptional residency here at Luma this June. It is not the first conversation between Homi K. Bhabha and William Kentridge. In 2018, Homi Bhabha wrote a text of major importance on William Kentridge's opera The Head and the Load, addressing the forgotten African porters of the First World War who died by hundreds of thousands due to inhumane treatment inflicted by European armies. A first conversation about The Great Yes, the Great No already took place in April in Cape Town, where they exchange on chance, risk, fragmentation, and the relationship between surrealism and negritude. We look forward to hearing you continue this conversation in situ on the stage opera itself. Thank you very much, Homi, for coming here at Luma. We know it wasn't easy, and we hope the opera yesterday and the forthcoming discussion were worth the trip. I would like also to take this opportunity to thank and congratulate deeply William Kentridge, your studio, and the team of the office for the fantastic artwork you have given us to experience here at Luma Hall through the opera and the exhibition Je n'attends plus, presented here at La Mécanique Générale. And also all the teams at Luma who are working on this event because also they are working every night for the opera, and tonight it's the last one. So let's give a big round of applause to all of the collaborators. And Omi and William, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just a few words. Flora, you have been instrumental and inspirational in bringing us together. Thank you very much. Dear William, I flew straight into this last night. From 37,000 feet, I was elevated to 45,000 feet during the performance. So, thank you for this great transcendental moment.
Thank you.
I want to thank you. I want to thank your entire troupe, your colleagues who are so remarkable, who I've seen often now. And I can truly say that you bring to art, to theater, to cinema, to the combination of all these art forms, something which is so different from almost anything that most of us have seen, which is why, in keeping with your naming of various surrealists as being the surrealist of the dialectic, the surrealist, today I name you the surrealist maestro of movement and mediation. The notion of mediation, of course, I learned very much from my reading of French thinkers, but you are now the embodiment of the surrealism of mediation. I wanted to, there's so much to talk about, but what I want to start with is something that you said to me 15 minutes ago while we were talking. And you said, you know, it's amazing how this work has been in gestation for quite a while. But many of the foundational ideas or works from which this sprung, I've completely forgotten about. So I called it the amnesia of making. The way in which while making you are reminded, and doing is the meaning. Meaning is not what you have stocked up in the archive of your mind, but things that remind you now, not of the past, but the way the past, in a way, becomes the future of the work you're making. You're always running to keep up with the past.
Yes, I think that, I mean, to talk about the amnesia in the making, just in concrete terms. Some years ago, I came across, many years ago, Mayakovsky play Mystery Bouffe, which was an early Mayakovsky play written just after the Russian Revolution, and it describes a series of different characters, historical. There's a chorus of clean, which is the bourgeoisie, a chorus of the unclean, who are the workers. And I started working with costume designer who were talking about making puppets, imagining a chorus of the clean and of the unclean. This was during COVID. And then that transformed into the work on a Shostakovich symphony, and the puppets came into a Shostakovich symphony, and there were a whole lot of historical characters. And then we thought, how do we bring these cardboard faces and the idea of these puppets from the Soviet Union to connect somehow to Africa? That became a project for this live theater. And after a while, I came across the story of the boat going from Marseille to Martinique, and the story of Negritude and the characters of Fanon and Césaire, and that became a connection. So the project then developed into The Great Yes and the Great No, and it became the boat journey from Marseille to Martinique, and everybody's on board. There's a chorus of women, there are the people who are represented with coffee pots on their faces. And what I had forgotten until really yesterday was that this Mayakovsky play, The Mystery Bouffe, is set on board an ark, a boat, escaping. And during the course of it, there's the conflict between the clean and unclean, and it ends with the clean, the chorus of the clean, or the clean, the bourgeoisie being thrown over at the time of the Russian Revolution, and everybody sings the Internationale. And I realized, I'd completely forgotten that that's in fact what we've made. We've made an interpretation of the Mayakovsky mystery bouffe. But if I'd had that in my mind, the kind of leaps that happened to bring the different surrealists on, there are no surrealists in the mystery bouffe, to say let's work with the politics of Vichy France and the movement of the Caribbean thinkers like Fanon and Césaire would not have been there. So obviously it's not, and part of my brain is remembering this foundational story of the Mayakovsky play and those elements, which then get forgotten, and in this unconscious way the whole piece develops as this recreation or reworking of the Mayakovsky. So that's what I would take this necessary kind of amnesia to be. There's also a way in which I remember years ago we spoke about the Bandung Conference. Homi and I had spoken about this conference in 1955 of non-aligned countries, which had many great people and thinkers there. And I thought, was it possible to do a piece of theatre around that? And I certainly couldn't imagine it. But one of the things that struck me was the story of Tito, who had sent his boat and his cameraman to Algeria at the time of the revolution. I thought, can we do something with that archive footage of the boat going to Algeria from Yugoslavia as this connection again from Europe and its socialist and communist history to Africa, and what is that relationship? And so in a way also that's it's not exactly redoing the Bandung Conference, but it's a moment that was also sitting somewhere underneath.
So bearing in mind what my wife said to me before I left this morning, Homi, remember, nobody wants to listen to you. They are there to listen to Willie. So bearing that in mind, I have to just say a couple of things here. One, that I think the importance of this thing that I've called the amnesia coming out of our conversation 10 minutes ago should not be minimized. Because, of course, you can psychoanalytically think about it, but I think about it more in terms of what Walter Benjamin called the afterlife of things. Very few references, but very significant. And he said, the afterlife is a constellation where the past is not the past, the future is not the future, and the present has to deal with it. In my language, I would say the past doesn't die, the future doesn't wait to be born, but we have to perform the present. And I think that's what the work is so strongly about, because if it had a sense of the pastness of the past would never erupt as it does now in your work. But I also want to say that this idea of the idea of the play is exactly that. It is translational and not foundational. That your whole approach is to look and see, not to move from a foundation to another foundation, not to move from the beginning to an end, but to be so concerned with the middle of things, transition, what happens during the process of transformation, not beginning and end, but in the middle. And that's what I see as being one of the dominant metaphors, if you like, of this great work.
So there are different ways in which it, as you say, it's caught in transition. And it's, okay, we'll get back to that, but there's a way in which, and these conversations which Homi and I have had over the course of the making, many conversations over the last years, there's a way in which the work doesn't start blindly, it's not coming from nowhere. I was interested to think, what are the relations that are currently in the conversations in the air around South Africa and many other places of Fanon, of questions, do you understand the world in terms of class interest, or do you understand it in terms of racial divisions? These are all floating very much day to day in South African politics and questions. But when you come into the studio, that's an impulse, that's something in the air, that's a question which is nagging. But when you come in to the studio, in a way those fade away and one gets caught in the process of making, which are often very different questions, but in the hope that at the end they will connect to some of those larger questions. So the question of transition and movement. In the studio, that became a question of, do we get a hydraulic jack so we can lift the stage here and lift that part of the stage to get the movement of the ship, which was a real consideration. And then that became insane, of course. And then we thought, then, does the whole background move? Do we see the ship behind? Then we discovered, no, in fact, the grammar of that is that the railings, the part of the superstructure of the boat that is projected, stays static, but that the sky or the images behind need to keep in a kind of movement. And then it gets further. What is so much that our audience is going to leave retching, and what is so subtle that no one really notices it? What is that? So that becomes a question of tact in the moment of looking, but it does, when the piece emerges, obviously connect to what you were saying of instability, of the furniture and the objects as the way you see on boats that tables and chairs can slide across from side to side. So that's another kind of amnesia, of kind of leaving the big questions aside, not because they're not important or because they're not part of the thinking, but because they slide underneath in the process of making.
And return again.
And return again and are always there. Like I'm sure the Mayakovsky mystery booth was sitting somewhere inside me the whole time. So I don't think, oh gosh, my feeling is, how can I not have understood that's what we were doing? It's so, in retrospect, so obvious. There was a boat, there's a chorus, there are the people being thrown overboard. These are historical characters. But it is a...
Yeah, but it appears as a different thing. So in the Mayakovsky, there is the clean and the unclean. And the cleansed bourgeois, the clean bourgeois, finally lose out. But that's not what you do. You make life much more difficult. All your work is about the yes and the no, the head and the load. So these conjunctions, these articulations, which come because you're interested in the process of the middle, in speaking from the middle, not from the beginning or the end, and that middle range is your studio. The way you walk in and out, in and out, in and out, that's the importance conceptually of the working in the studio. The associative things you print, you pin on the walls, things come in, things go out. So this whole way of thinking about the threshold is what I'm calling, in my work, threshold thinking, where the threshold is open in both directions, but there is a threshold. So that you can't simply talk about the floating of the signifier of the present into the future. There is that, as I said, that embattled present where the past doesn't die and the future doesn't wait to be born, and we have to deal with it. And here, I would say that one of those moments that comes back is the phrase, we will be dominated but not domesticated, from Fanon. And everything, and what the beauty of it is, to go back to what you were just saying, thinking about things through the making, not just about the symbolic idea of the sextant, the global sextant, which goes, you cannot navigate your way, the great yes and the great no, the storm and the typhoon. You are always caught between. But the fascinating thing is the way in which the whole performance, the production, everything you cite is about power and domination. But the actual work is about not being domesticated. And one of the great issues that you come up with again and again is in language and movement and dance and music. Colonial domination or the demand for assimilation is something you reject because the work is translational. There are many languages. There are African languages. There is opera. There are different citations. And I think the important thing that people forget is that if you look positively at the process of migration, and so on. You see this great kind of vernacular cosmopolitanism, not the cosmopolitanism of people who go learn 5 languages because that's what they were taught in school because of their position. So it seems to me that the process of translation is what remains in the gut and then comes out. Sorry, I don't know how far to go with this metaphor. I've got myself into trouble. But it comes out, let's say, as a new form of energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, there is, as you say, literally direct translation. So in our first chorus, for example, it has the translation of it. The text, the libretto, is made up of fragments from many, many different authors, and literally then cut up the way the surrealists would, but then but the surrealists would then have put them all in a hat and taken them out one by random, allowing chance to form the structure of the libretto, which is not what we do. So it's not writing a libretto and knowing, we've got to get from A to B, but it's taking phrases that seem charged in one way or another, that, without interrogating why, making a table full of different phrases which have been gleaned from many sources, and then physically moving them, both reading and moving. So it's a mixture of reading and being aware of them, but a physical shifting into groups and patterns till gradually one says, well, these phrases seem good for the captain, these ones link together for the chorus, these ones would go somewhere else, and gradually find what those phrases which came from a half-understood impulse gather into. So the translations, firstly, they're foreign writers being translated into English. And so for the chorus, I would then give Nhlanhla Mahlangu, the composer, saying, here is the text of the first chorus. And he would give those texts to the 7 singers, who would translate all of those into their mother tongue, which would be isiZulu, Sesotho, Tswana, Tsonga, many different South African languages. So in further translation, and then find a vocal line for each of those lines, and then he and the singers would work out which of those different languages was best for those lines and how they could fit together. So between the original language, the English translation, the rearranging of the text, the translation into different African languages, and then the translation of that into the music, it is a completely unstable text that finds its home.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll read the text of the first.
I think you should.
Okay.
I think you should. And I want to say that the fact that we don't understand some of it, it's good, you could always find them, but we don't understand in the operatic some of the African languages or some of the other European languages that you've used. I think not understanding is extremely important because that allows for an affective identification. And it's also about the fact that to be really hospitable to what is different, to be hospitable, it is to trust another language, not to say, I understand you because I know exactly what you're saying. It is to say, I'm open to this difference.
But I think there's also one other element to that translation. If you understand it perfectly clearly, as you say, then there's not really an effort or so there's a generosity about saying, even though I don't understand it, you are welcome as a stranger. But there's also something which we find in ourselves. If one is hearing a language you half understood, you know most of the words, but there's a word you don't understand, or you're listening to someone but you're mishearing one word, it's not that someone says, all right, here's the sentence gap, the rest of the sentence, here's what I'm hearing, oh, I didn't hear that, it goes on. There's something in us which can't resist trying to working as if it might mean something, as if this was the missing word. And I think what that does is it makes us also aware of our active part of making sense of the world, not just receiving it, but constructing it. So I think both that sense of generosity of taking language on trust and understanding our involvement in making the sense.
It would be great to start with and then show that,
Okay.
because I think the difference between the surrealist, in the shaking the hat and seeing where it falls, is that they're interested in chance.
Right.
You are interested in risk.
Yeah.
And I want to take that up afterwards, the kinds of risk that you face in the great yes and the great no?
So we'll come back to
Yep.
that. But for example, just to read you some of the text, and then we'll play some of the. Do we have sound, Josh, to play with it when we do? Okay, good. So the lines are: now the house of justice has collapsed. There has been wrong done. I ask for right. You whom I could not save, listen to me. Try to understand this simple speech. No foreign sky protected me. No stranger's wing protected my face. I ask this bed, I ask this chair, why? Why is this age worse than others? You whom I could not save, listen to me. Disaster has fallen on everyone everywhere. Misfortune flows as from a water main. So the first line, now the house of justice has collapsed, is Aeschylus from the Eumenides. The second line, there has been wrong done, I ask for right, is from the libation bearers, also of Aeschylus. But then, you whom I could not save, listen to me, try to understand this simple speech, is in fact Milosz, the poet. No foreign sky protected me, no stranger's wing protected my face, is Anna Akhmatova, another Russian poet. I ask this chair why, is Marina Tsvetaeva. Misfortune flows as from a water main, is Mayakovsky. Disaster has fallen on everyone everywhere, again Anna Akhmatova. So in this first chorus, it's very much, so it's saying, even though these come from thousands of years apart in different continents and different ways, they seem to coalesce as a possible chorus. So maybe we watch the 3 minutes, Josh, of the same text that I've just been reading to you.
Because of the amnesia. Sorry, that's the way, because they come together because of this amnesia, not that you intentionally want to make connections between Aeschylus and Akhmatova. And I think that's the really important point about the process.
Wena endingamncedanga ndinike indlebe zama ukuvisisa le ntetho elula angikakhuselwa ndingwaba tebekuhamba izifika namthwalo azikaze zangisiza ingani le nkathi le inobunqokololo idlula ezinye kungani le nkari le ibile idlula tingwane iphalaza lemntu wonke iphalaza lemntu wonke iphalaza lemntu wonke jikelele jikelele anile nkarile ibile kundlula tingwane inganile nkathile inobunqokololo idlula ezinye ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa lipokoza usutu kangwane lithi pokopoko likopoze lithi pokopoko ilishwa lipokoza okomfula usutu kangwane lithi pokopoko likopoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa lipokoza okomfula usutu kangwane lithi pokopoko likopoze lithi kopokopo.
There's a line there which says, no stranger's wing protected my face. And I like to alight on that line to talk about a larger theme here. I think, I said that the difference between the traditional serialistic mode and yours is that they deal with chance, you deal with risk. There are very important problems of the risk of democracy, the risk of freedom, a risky freedom, a difficult freedom. And now in this work, you foreground the issue of shame, which I believe is a profoundly contemporary ethical political problem. Guilt is only about the law. And as you know from recent events in the United States concerning somebody who has a souffle which is about to collapse on his head, the collapsing souffle felon, guilt doesn't matter because you can turn it around, you can lie. The same happens, of course, in India, it happens in China, it happens in Russia, it happens, I'm sure, in South Africa too. So we live in an era of shame where guilt and the institutions of democracy, the rule of law, are being pushed aside. Now, this great work is about a time when people wanted a new kind of state. It's a surrealist vision of a national state. Therefore, it's not a nationalist state. It's not the ethno-nationalism that we have. What interests you in shame? And do you think I'm right about talking about the shamelessness?
Yes. I mean, there's a line, the sense of shame has disappeared from man,
right,
and shamelessness roams all over the earth. I'd have to check through to discover in the footnotes of the libretto who was it is. But it seems to me a fundamental category that if you can feel no shame yourself, you are become in a way untouchable. If nothing you can do causes any of that sense of embarrassment or feeling you have failed as in the deepest sense of what a person needs to be. If shame disappears, then everything is just about spin. And I think that is a central condition that we seem to be living in. And the fact of the doubt one has of evidence now, that any photograph can be any other photograph, gets expanded to saying, oh, well, all the evidence about me, therefore, is fake, therefore I don't need to feel bad about anything I've done. And I don't know how if the sense of shame disappears, how it gets reimposed. There's usually some person in your head that you see looking at you against whom you feel embarrassed by one's behavior to feel shame. And if you exclude that person, if you are the only person in the world, that's hard to...
Yeah, and this, given that you talked about the Greeks, I mean, this reminds me very much of some of the Platonic dialogues, the Hippias Major, for instance, where Socrates continually has this other person at a few seconds difference talking to him and saying, are you really right about this? Is this what you believe? Whereas Hippias, who is the kind of Trumpian, bumpian figure, couldn't care less. He says he's making money, he's giving lectures all over Greece. He couldn't care less. He says, as long as I hear the applause of the audience, that's fine. I get my money, an issue you talk about, and go. But those lines on shame did make me think that this is a work very much about now. And it's very much about how shamelessness has very little has a deep social foundation, but does not have institutional protections as much as we might want. And I think that's one of the great yes and no's of this work. We need the shameless, we need shame, but how do we initiate it? And how do we institutionalize it?
So I think it's, obviously there's the work that happens, and then there are different lines or different fragments which come out at different moments more strongly, both of which are about the particular person receiving it, but also about things that are in it which are waiting to get a lot. Some of them within the structure of making the piece, we say, let's emphasize that, let's give Suzanne more space to speak, let's make sure these lines of the captain are strongly there. I mean, a lot of the captain's lines, almost the majority, I would say, come from different poems of Bertolt Brecht, in which there's a kind of a cynicism. It's not a cynicism, it's a skepticism of good intentions. So when he writes, learn the ABC says, you will be dealt with. I mean, what are the central lessons? If wherever you are going, there it will be worse. Wherever you're coming from, there it was better. Wherever you are coming from, there you will not be missed. Wherever you are going to, there you will not be welcome. This is 1936. Brecht's writing it, but it feels, okay, this is the condition of so many millions of people in the world now, trying to leave one place to get to another.
Yes, and if I might just add another figure who might have been on the boat, and I'm actually proposing that in our questions, to which we should get to in a few minutes, I'm going to suggest people I think should be on the boat. William should. And please add to our boat crew, whoever else you think might be on the boat. I think that's a better way to open up to the discussion.
Yes, okay.
Just in relation to what you just said, in her first piece in English, written in English, Hannah Arendt says, in the piece called What is a Refugee? She says, our enemies put us in concentration camps and our friends put us in detention camps. So I think that this irony that you're talking about works very well. And if we move on to the game, who else should be on the boat?
I mean, just while we're on refugees, there are two lines which, again, I'm not certain of the author, but also from the 1940s, the line about how a refugee is an unwilling tourist, and a refugee is the one honest man whose papers can never be in order. That sense of being
and
stuck.
And of course, you put it in a marvelous context in the opera.
Yes. So those lines, I think, when I read them, they don't come by chance, but they jump out because I think, God, this is being written 80 years ago, but it feels it's the condition of where we are now. So the lines do call to be used in that way.
Yeah.
But there were many masks that were, Wilfredo Lam, the Cuban surrealist painter, was actually on the ship, but we see his head once, but he's not on it. Gandhi is on it, but as you said, maybe Nehru would have been.
Yeah, I think Nehru would have been a better figure because Nehru was the guy who was on the yes and the no side of it. He was Western educated, he was a Fabian socialist, he had a certain notion of what progress was, a European notion of civility and progress. On the other hand, he was invested and interested in the Soviet model. So he was on the ship. He was part of this vacillation. I think Hannah Arendt is somebody else who was on the ship, who says at the very moment of the nation state, you began to have huge abuses in the politics of refugees. New minorities were formed at that point, and the nation state itself produces the problems that we then have to deal with. How do we think about this issue? Of course, you have Fanon on the boat. But there is something here. Why I always felt that the ironies that you deal with seemed not to fit with the Suzanne Césaire embrace of a kind of almost Douanier Rousseau type of nature and mythological politics.
I mean, the Suzanne Césaire was a discovery while we were working on the project. I knew the great poem of Aimé Césaire, The Notebooks of a Return to My Native Land. But while working on it, came across his wife, Suzanne, who'd written, in fact, the key essays of the Negritude movement in Paris and her magazine, Tropique. And she wrote a few short essays, and then her other writings were burnt before she died. And at first, yes, they are. They're much more, they don't have the same bite as the Brecht do, and nor the bite of the Fanon. And at first, we'd given her, to keep the tone similar, a lot of lines, but realized we had her character, but she was having to give Fanon's line, she was having to give Césaire's line, she was having to give Brecht's line. And we thought, this is a character who in a way, has been written out of history. So to have her on the deck, but unable to have her own words. So they are of a different register, and it's her thinking aloud in the cabin, but they are her sections from her essays. And that was the thing, we first had the other lines in the first workshop, and then at a certain point, no, this is kind of crazy. And they're beautiful in a different way, her lines. And they're not just Douanier Rousseau. There's one of her lines says, our poetry is going to be cannibal, or it will not be poetry. Enough of the bougainvilleas and the hyacinths.
Yes.
But yes, it is a different register.
It's a different register from the one we choose. Okay, yes. So William, before we open up, who would you put on the boat from South Africa?
I think everybody would have a really good time if Desmond Tutu was on board. He would be and also someone who's able to understand both the seriousness and ironies, to understand the absurd, not as a joke, but the absurd of the condition of logics falling apart.
Yeah.
So I think that, he would be our local hero I would put on.
Yes, that's a great choice, because he did have a sparkling sense of humor and a profound commitment to what he thought was right. So if we now open up to our friends in the audience, thank you for being here. And
yes, Wilfredo Lam, who was a Cuban artist, was in Europe and went back to Cuba and was very central in both the arts of Cuba, but also brought kind of Cuban surrealism forward. I think as we went, he was, we had a mask, we thought he would be there, but our focus then came onto Martinique and the people from Martinique primarily. And so, yes, it's not to say he's an unimportant artist or he couldn't have been done, but in terms of the journey, he didn't really, the same even as Claude Lévi-Strauss and his Tristes Tropiques and books that came out of this journey. We see his face and we note him there, but gradually we condense things into the fewer. It's really the only person who is actually on the boat that is present is André Breton. And the rest is the idea and the idea of the journey, but it became very much focused on the Martinican writers, Damas, the Nadal sisters, Cézanne and Aimé Césaire. Edwin Glisson, a later writer from Martinique, was there on the boat and had very interesting things to say, but it became one step too far to bring him on.
And the boat is a great translational metaphor itself, because it's not so much beginning to end of the journey, but what's happening in the actual process of translation.
Just in the nature of translation, the project also had an origin of thinking about something to do for one of the Greek classical theaters, for Epidauros. And the nature of the Greek classical theater is that you have a flat area on the ground, which is the orchestra, as they call it, where the chorus is. And then behind the orchestra on the ground, you have a raised section, the skena, where the gods or other characters might appear to talk. And that was the idea at the first, that the this area here would be where the chorus is the whole time, and our characters with masks would be on a narrow strip up top, which is the good idea. It was very clear. But as we worked, it became clear, various things became clear. One, to insist that our wonderful chorus always has to stay below decks became impossible. They demanded, their voices demanded the space. So they float between. They're not just the third-class passengers, even though their function is as chorus. And it also became clear that if we had a big chorus and we only had our singers right at the back, in a way we were pushing everything far apart. So it had to be translated. But the fundamental structure of what you see is a lower area, which was the orchestra, and then these upper decks, which was the back of a Greek theatre, which became the deck of a ship. So the ship also emerged, how we showed it on stage, came from a different source also. So, there are so many possible productions that could happen, which could be one. I mean, in the end, we said, well, our coffee pots could be the representatives of, how everyone wants to parse it. Are these the Vichy Pétainists? Because the shape of the coffee pot is like a Maréchal Pétain's kepi. So that became a clear one. Are they the whole of the French bourgeoisie? Are they the whole colonial project? Without saying specifically who they are, we know they refer to the Vichy government very clearly. And the speech that's given by Luc, which is mimicking the archival footage of one of the politicians, obviously pushes that further. The poem or the text that the coffee pots have towards them saying, Pants in a coupe pas, we don't cut bread, bread is broken. A fork is not a toothpick. A mother wants a well-brought-up son. Those are actually lines of a poem by Damas, this Martinican-educated black man who came to France and was the one about, I feel ridiculous in their bowler hat, in their stiff collar, in their monocles. It was also a poem of Damas. And in a way, he was a minor character, but his texts were so theatrical and performable that they got primary place over many other writers that could have been on the boat.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't see you, but I think, just talking to both of you, I think this is a very important question. But the idea of being given the second chance, somebody of manifestly evil, not only intentions, but actions, being given a second chance, is in a way the problem of shame, particularly as you see it in certain political moments. It is the problem of shame, of there being a shamelessness in the international regime, and that bargains with worse than the devil are made for this notion of we've got to get on with it. We have to survive. And I think that's a very poignant but also problematic issue, so I think Klaus Barbie could, in a way, it would have restructured it. But this notion of giving the shameless, giving the evil a second chance would really fit with this problem of what happens if the great yes and the great no cancel each other out. And we see that surprisingly often.
Yes, I mean, she is on the boat. She is on the boat in the voice of the women, very specifically saying, this woman is utterly bereft, this woman is utterly alone with her husband dead, her son in jail, pray for me, is a line that's in the lament section of the thing. So not her photo, but her deep spirit is there very much on the boat.
Yeah, and that's another splendid suggestion. Yes, she's there, and I think what is also there is the fact that Emmanuel Levinas writes so much about that particular Akhmatova standing in a queue, standing in a line, and he uses that as a way of thinking of the face of the neighbor, the demand placed on you by the face of the neighbor, and of which you are being then implicated, as he says, not only in the life, but also in the death, which he doesn't mean physical death, but also, the spiritual death of the neighbor. So I think, as you have earlier worked with Levinas, I think Levinas is also treading lightly on the deck.
As you say, the demand of the face of the other is a central question. Yes. Before we get to that, just a remembering that the great poem of Anna Akhmatova standing outside the prison waiting, it starts with her giving a description of standing outside the prison waiting for news for hours every day with the food parcel they hope will get. And one of the women says, "Who will ever report? Who will ever write about this?" And Anna Akhmatova says, "I will. This I will write." And then begins the poem. And that's kind of the corollary to Bertolt Brecht in his poem when somebody says, and in the dark times shall there be poetry? And he says, yes, there shall be poetry about the dark times. So both of those are kind of ring in my ears in a fairly distant way when we're involved in making the piece. I think it would be nice to make a journey with Molly Bloom and Leopold, but it'll be on a different ship.
Of course, that's really a wonderful insight. In Coetzee's Elizabeth Costello, that there is that whole reference to the end of Joyce, because she writes supposedly a companion piece to the end of it. So maybe we could think about putting Coetzee there?
Andre Breton in the reports of the boat apparently went around the whole time just saying under his breath, "Bastard, salaud," about everybody he passed on the ship. I would imagine Coetzee walking around just keeping a tight-lipped silence the entire way and being very unhappy that there was nowhere to cycle around on his boat. No, there are many, many virtues of John Coetzee, but having him as a companion on the ship would be hard work.
Maybe I have had a somewhat different experience, but but the other question you ask is the question of intellectuals today. And intellectuals today? I heard forget it, a terrifying story last night, but let's put that off. Let me just say that I think universities, at least in the States where I come from, and in England, which I know quite well, in India, are in a very, very bad way for all kinds of financial reasons. Academics are not allowed to function really as intellectuals. They have to function either as scholars or as academics in a very narrow way. They have to be very careful what they say and how they say it, etc. I think intellectuals today is a conversation between artists of all kinds, as we saw the panoply of mediation. That's why I call you the surrealist of mediation, what we saw yesterday, is this new collaboration between artists and thinkers, where the work somehow doesn't originate in one place or another. It comes from somewhere in between, in that transitional space. I think that's where the great hope for me lies, number one. Number two, the great hope for me lies in movement politics, with all its problems. With all its problems. Nobody knows who the leaders are, how long will it last, when will it collapse. But movement politics, as opposed to party politics, just for me personally, is the form of the stimulation of thinking and the reconstruction of one's political commitment. It's deeply problematic. But I have learned more about the United States from Black Lives Matter. Whether I agree or not fully with it, that's another matter. I think Me Too has been a major move. Even the Arab Spring, which so quickly turned into the Arab Winter, has been a place where these repeated or iterative ignitions of a moral spirit, what was it, after the George Floyd event, which is, I think, there were, in 78 countries, more than 8,700 demonstrations. You know, that spirit comes, unfortunately, from death or dying very often, not only, but it is the kind of cosmopolitan spirit of saying, we know the great no, but we will also speak the great yes. And movement politics is where I think, for me, intellectual and political commitment comes. And maybe it happens because it doesn't have the stolid, do the fuck that you want shamelessness of party political institutions. You know, we raised, 37 million in one night after a man, as a felon, has lied his way through. We raised 37 million. Who the hell cares? It doesn't come to me now from party politics. It's very much movement politics with all its problems and failures, short periods of time that really brings back. And I want to bring that back to William, that William's operatic, theatrical artwork, as I see it, is often constructed around these moments. You know, you don't look for long at ever, for a long narrative thread. But it is these moments where I think the aesthetic, the ethical, the political, the performative, the affective come together in a very remarkable way. But we don't trust short times. We always want to talk about centuries. We want to talk about long periods. I think there's going to be a shift in the time of our lives, and William has contributed to that enormously. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we can just close the event now with this beautiful conclusion.